Hi, I'm Johnny from UltimatePaperMache.com, and today I want to talk about how to make paper mache smoother. Paper strips and paste specifically have kind of a signature look to it. Maybe you can see the edges of your paper when you're looking at it even after it's been painted, or maybe there's little dips and ridges that are showing up just because of a crumpled paper and masking tape armature that's underneath it, where the paper strips are following the contours. For some projects, the traditional look of paper strips and paste is cool. I mean, it's actually perfect for what we're looking for. But sometimes it's not, and we would really prefer that it be a bit smoother. Now, that's actually one of the reasons that I came up with the paper mache clay recipe. You'll find that recipe out on my website. I'll put a link to it down below. That's what the lion was made with. With paper mache clay, you put it on and you can make it exactly the shape you want it. If there's a little bit of dip, more paper mache clay goes into that dip and it smooths everything out. Paper mache clay does have a lot of paper in it, and so it does have a texture, but you can smooth it off as much as you want to with just by dampening a knife with a mixture of glue and water. That makes your knife really slick. You can do the same thing if you put gloves on. Well, I guess you could use your finger if you wanted to without the gloves fit. It kind of dries on there and feels kind of weird, so I wouldn't suggest doing that, but you can if you want to. But the whole purpose of the glue and water is that it makes your hand or the flat side of a knife really slick. And so it just slides right over the top of the wet paper mache, and you can make it as smooth as you want to. It will still have a texture because of the high concentration of paper in the paper mache clay recipe. Just to give you an idea of the texture, this fellow was made quite a long time ago with paper mache clay. He's one of the projects in my book, How to Make Animal Sculptures with Paper Mache Clay. And I just took a long time to smooth it off with a knife idea, like I told you. And you can see a texture. It's not porcelain smooth, definitely not. But I don't usually go for that anyway, so I really like the way that paper mache clay comes out. A lot of people prefer it to be smoother, and they prefer the air dry clay recipe to the original paper mache clay recipe, so it's totally up to you. If you are using the paper mache clay and after it's dry you would like it to be just a little bit smoother or a little less textured, then go ahead and use the DIY gesso recipe that's out on my website. I'll put a link to all these down below, but if you ever lose the link, just go to the art library that's at the top of my blog, and it's going to be over in the recipe section. We've got quite a few recipes out there, and you can always find them easily that way. The gesso is made out of drywall joint compound and glue. Paper mache clay is also drywall joint compound and glue with paper added and a little bit of flour to stiffen it up. So if you're making paper mache clay, you already have the ingredients for the do-it-yourself gesso. The gesso is kind of nice because it does go on smoothly and you can sand it really easily. You can put on as many layers as you want to. But if you're using paper strips and paste, there are several things that you can do to make it smoother. Now, the first thing that you need to do is right from the very beginning when you're applying your paper mache, and that is to tear your paper strips instead of cutting them. You also want to use a paper that's soft enough so that when you get it wet, it will just naturally form itself to the underlying contours of your armature. That's why most people use newspaper, in fact, because it just works really well. Now, hopefully, after the paper mache is dry, let's fingers crossed, you don't have any really big dips or anything in it. You just want to make it smoother. And one way you can do that, if there are enough layers on there, you can use a really fine sandpaper and just sand it as if it was wood. But you want to be really careful that you don't get so carried away that you actually dig through the paper mache layers right into the underlying armature. But what if you have more of a problem than just a slight texture on the outside of your paper mache? What if you have big dips, maybe because you had a problem making your armature the way I did back when I made my whale? I'll tell you about that in a second. If you make a crumpled paper armature, and you're wrapping it up with masking tape. It's a traditional way to make armatures. I've made a whole bunch of them that way, but quite often you do get kind of a bumpy surface on your paper mache sculpture. And sometimes that's okay and sometimes it's not. So there are some products that you can use on the outside of your paper mache that will make it nice and smooth. Some people like using wood filler. I don't much care for wood filler for two reasons. The first one is it comes in really little bottles, and most of the things that I make are a whole lot bigger than that. I like things big. And the other problem with it is that I buy some, I bring it home, maybe I open it once and don't use the rest of it, and by the time I get back to it, it's all dried out and as hard as a rock. So that's just a personal thing. I don't use it. Now, some people like to use Bondo. It's a really fast-setting epoxy putty. You get it at an automotive supply store, and I think people use it maybe when somebody hits their car with their door, you know, and you get that little ding in it, and you want to smooth that out without taking the whole car apart. And it works really well. It does harden really fast, but you can sand it. It will dry harder than the paper mache around it. Wood filler, I think, probably does too. So with either one of those products, if you're just putting it on in one small space, you'd want to be really careful when you're sanding it so that you don't actually dig into the paper mache all the way down into your armature. Now, there's another product that's also epoxy, but gives you a whole lot more working time, and that's Epoxy Sculpt. Or Smooth On makes one. There's several different kinds that are actually made for sculptors, not mechanics. And so you have like 2 or 3 hours to actually work with it. And although I've never used it to fill in dips on a paper mache sculpture, you could use it that way. It would work just fine. The one product that I do use really often is Drywall Joint Compound or Spackle. Either one will work for this. You're not mixing it with anything, so it doesn't really matter. And all you do with the joint compound is, after your paper mache is dry, fill in any deep parts, put a really thin film over everything else, let it dry completely. If you sand it, put on a mask and take it outside so that you don't end up with drywall joint compound dust. It's really, really fine. You don't want it in your lungs, and you don't want it all over the house. So put on a mask and take it outside. And it sands really easy. It's intended for the construction industry, of course, and they're always in a hurry to get things done. So joint compound is really easy to sand. Use really fine sandpaper, and you can make your sculpture just as smooth as you want to. Now, there's two things that you can do after the joint compound is dry and you know for sure that all the shapes are the way you want them. The way I did it when I first started using joint compound on sculptures, I think that was years and years ago, I made a whale for the wall, and it was really, really bumpy. I did a really bad job basically making the armature, and it was horrible. So I got out the joint compound and I put it on there. I was worried that because the whale was so flat and so wide, I worried that just the general flexibleness of the sculpture was going to cause the joint compound to crack and pop off, which is entirely possible. So what I did was, after I got it all smoothed off, I put one last layer of paper mache over it. It turned out really nice. But what I did with my cats is I just put a real thin layer of the joint compound over this cardboard mask. It's got cardboard, paper mache, and then a really thin layer of the joint compound on it. It's a little bit flexible, not very, but just a little bit. And then I put an acrylic gesso on top of it. And that combination of the drywall joint compound with the acrylic gesso on top of it worked really well. That's definitely the way I'm going to be doing it from now on, as a matter of fact. So I hope that helps. And now, if you haven't already thought of a project for yourself and you want to get started with paper mache, hit the art library link up at the top. There's over 400 projects on this site. You're sure to find one that you would really like to try, just to kind of get your feet wet with paper mache. Go pick one, go make something, and when you get it done, come back to the Daily Sculptors page and show it off. We would love to see how it comes out. I'll see you there.